Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to dive right into the fascinating micro-decisions that happen on an immigrant's plate. We're zooming all the way out from just one person's everyday dinner to a massive global culinary map. It's an incredible journey that reveals how the simple choice of what to eat tells a hidden story of adaptation, survival, and ultimately belonging.
Picture this for a second. You pack up your entire life, you move to a brand new country, and suddenly you discover that the bread you've eaten every single day of your life simply does not exist in your new city. Our source for today's explainer, an Iranian immigrant who moved to Philadelphia, faced exactly this problem. Those slightly sour, charred flatbreads from home, the barbari and the sangak, were just nowhere to be found, not even a Persian market in sight.
And honestly, that realization leads to what the author calls a quiet panic in the supermarket. You start desperately reaching for substitutions. Pita becomes your very first ambassador. It's close in spirit, but it's just not quite right in its soul. The author actually calls this carbohydrate diplomacy, which is such a brilliant way to describe the culinary equivalent of grasping for a word in your second language because your first language is failing you. But eventually, salvation shows up in a totally unexpected form, a bag of Trader Joe's love just sitting there in the bread aisle.
Fast forward a few years, though, and we get this huge plot twist. And this perfectly illustrates the absolute core of our explainer today. Over time, the author eventually learns to love sourdough. But, and this is absolutely crucial, they don't learn to love sourdough instead of traditional bread. They learn to love it right alongside it. They literally just have two kinds of bread sitting on the counter.
Now, that simple little phrase, "I now love sourdough," represents a massive framing shift. For a long time, we've kind of viewed the evolution of an immigrant's diet as this passive measure of assimilation, right? Like you just abandon the old world for the new one. But that is completely backwards. It's actually an active, super dynamic strategy of cultural endurance. It's a test that someone takes 3 times a day at every single meal, deciding exactly how much of the old world to hold on to and how much of the new world to invite onto the plate.
So let's actually look at the science behind this integration. Researchers call this the food test. And there is a literal scientific instrument used to measure it called the Food Neophobia Scale. It was built by psychologists Patricia Pliner and Karen Hobden back in 1992, and it measures one very specific treat: how reluctant you are to eat something you have never eaten before. Essentially, just plain, simple aversion to the unfamiliar.
Here is where it gets really interesting. What happens when immigrants are completely cut off from their native ingredients? Huge pressure gets applied to that neophobia scale. And data across multiple studies proves that bicultural eating, meaning you widen the table instead of completely replacing the old food, is undeniably the tastiest and the healthiest strategy. People with low neophobia actually rate new foods as more delicious. One study of Georgian immigrant women found that those who integrated different cuisines ended up with much healthier eating patterns. Another study from 2023 on Chinese immigrants in Portugal showed that over time they steadily, seamlessly mixed Chinese and Portuguese meals. Integration, according to the hard data, is literally the tastiest strategy you can pick.
To really wrap our heads around why this happens, we have to stop thinking of food as just calories and start thinking of it as a language. When immigrants move, they lose their public language almost immediately. But the kitchen? Well, the kitchen becomes this highly private sanctuary of belonging. It is the very last room in the house where a person remains totally fluent, where they don't have to translate themselves for anyone, even when the public dialect right outside their front door has to be English.
Because of that incredibly deep connection, food does way more than just track assimilation. Food is literal archaeology. It acts as a neurological archive. Think about how culture disappears in layers. First, maybe the accent goes, then the clothing changes, then the customs adapt, and eventually, even the native language fades. But food outlasts almost all of the rest of it. It records this deep migration history because your hands still know exactly how to make the rice, long after your conscious self has stopped insisting on the old ways. Every single kitchen keeps a geological layer of history.
And it's not just in private homes. Almost every famous national dish is actually just a brilliant fossil record of earlier migrations doing this exact same archaeology. The doner kebab? It wasn't born in Istanbul. It was invented by Turkish guest workers in 1970s West Berlin. Tex-Mex only exists because a political border moved right through a population of people who didn't move an inch. And the New York bagel? That iconic staple traveled all the way from Eastern Europe to the Lower East Side, just picking out cream cheese along the way.
Okay, but let's be real, these historical culinary substitutions don't always work out so perfectly. The author shares this hilarious and frankly catastrophic story of trying to use Asian noodles in a traditional Persian soup called reshteh because they couldn't find the proper ingredients. And instead of soup, the noodles fused into this single, defiant clump, literally an inedible doorstop. So while some food experiments turn into beautiful historical timestamps, that one was a culinary tombstone.
4 generations measured in tadig. To really see how this culinary archaeology evolves, and occasionally fails, we just need to watch a single family kitchen change over time. It's like a staircase across 4 generations. Generation 1 is all about preservation. The parents hold the line. They're cooking ghormeh sabzi every Friday as this act of cultural resistance. Then, Generation 2 brings hybridization. The kids bring home school lunches, and suddenly you've got a slice of Costco pizza sitting right next to the Persian rice. By Generation 3, it shifts to symbolism. Grandmother's tadig becomes this incredibly rare family heirloom because nobody else actually knows how to make it. But the 4th step, that is the real surprise: rediscovery. Young descendants are now actively reclaiming these recipes on TikTok. It goes from an inherited, closely guarded tradition to a fully conscious, intentional choice to keep the heritage alive.
But wait, this cultural exchange is absolutely not a one-way street. Eventually, the whole dynamic reverses entirely. Immigrant communities don't just sit there and absorb the host country's food culture, they begin to actively reshape the host country's palate. The host eats back.
And the examples we have of this are just incredible. Back in 2001, chicken tikka masala, which is a dish invented by South Asian immigrants adapting to British tastes, was literally declared a true British national dish. In the US, Mexican food went from being a novelty to Taco Tuesday, which is now a trademarked weekly cultural ritual. And right now, we're seeing this exact same process unfold with Persian food. Non-Iranians are becoming regular Friday night fixtures for Persian kebab. Ingredients like saffron and pomegranate molasses are quietly winning over diners who have absolutely zero Persian heritage.
Which brings us up to the macro level of global restaurant economies. When we look at diaspora dining, restaurant menus clearly reveal where a community sits on a really fascinating spectrum. On one end, you have what's called defensive sovereignty. That's reproducing a traditional menu exactly as it was back home, to protect a culture that feels endangered. On the exact opposite end, you have cultural confidence. That's when chefs feel so secure in their identity that they boldly experiment and adapt, totally unafraid of losing their roots.
When we compare these global diaspora cities side by side, we uncover this amazing sociological insight. Los Angeles, for instance, operates as a defensive fortress. The community is so incredibly huge that it can sustain these classic pre-revolution menus without ever needing to attract outsiders. But then look at New York City, a much smaller diaspora. They were practically forced to invent modern twists to win over strangers, pushing them straight into cultural confidence. London, they basically skipped the defensive phase entirely and went straight to international expansion. And Toronto sort of froze a brand new amber, reflecting a more present-day Tehran. What you should really take away from this is that a diaspora's size and its culinary risk appetite are inversely related. The safer and larger the community feels, the less they feel the need to experiment.
So what does this all mean? Which leads us to the ultimate question we really need to ask ourselves after going through all this fascinating sociological and scientific data. What does this food test, this tiny daily micro decision of what to put on a plate, actually measure in the end?
The answer is surprisingly profound. The food test doesn't just measure integration or assimilation. It measures a culture's psychological security. It tracks that beautiful, gradual shift from protecting an endangered heritage inside a defensive fortress to playfully and confidently inviting the entire world to pull up a chair to your table. It is, ultimately, the freedom to try the sourdough and to love the sourdough without ever feeling like it costs you your soul or your history.
Because an immigrant's plate isn't some ledger of what has been lost. It is a record of everything that has been embraced. As our author perfectly realized, I have 2 kinds of breads now, and on the best days, I think that was always where this story was going to end. And that powerful realization leaves us with a lingering thought to explore in our own lives today, whether we're immigrants or not. Take a look at your own kitchen, your own habits, the meals you share with your family. What unwritten history is hiding on your dinner plate tonight?